Is Russia's strategy in Bakhmut finally clear? Guys, I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's December 10th, 2022, Saturday. I don't take a day off, but then again, neither does the war. Let's get into it. So the biggest noteworthy change in the last 24 hours is actually in the north near Kupiansk, as you can see, Novoselivsk has actually been fully occupied by Russian forces. This is a development, as we've talked about. This seems like this northern line of contact is much more variable, as we've talked about, because a lot of the areas to the south have natural obstacles in their geography, namely the Seversky Donetsk River in the north here and the Dnipro in the south, that form sort of natural obstacles where big changes in fighting, where it's hard to dislodge battle lines. Similarly, in Bakhmut, you guys can see that the actual city of Bakhmut itself forms kind of a natural defensive line. And in the north, right, that's one of the reasons the lack of that terrain, because it's big, open, agrarian terrain, is one of the reasons I think you see changes to the battle lines pretty frequently. Still, Novoselivsk is not a significant, this is not a significant gain for Russia. You can see they also, like a mini Bakhmut, it took them a long time to eject Ukrainian forces from literally 6 city blocks. Not even that, literally like 2 neighborhoods. Hopefully, I assume that the Russians paid a considerable price to do that, and they didn't really gain anything, because as you guys can see, this main thoroughfare here, which is the closest thing to significant terrain, it's not usable by either force, right? Russians can only use this southern portion south of Novoselivsk, which has been the case basically for days. Oh, no, too far forward. Has been the case for days, and they can't really use it, and Ukrainians can only use it to the north of Novoselivsk. So it's a very contested piece of terrain, and I would be negligent to say that while obviously it is Russia seizing terrain, it's not a significant battlefield advantage. There's not significant key terrain that's being changing hands here. The real significance of the battle is, of course, in Bakhmut, where there's no reported changes yet on this deep state map. As you guys can see, Russians are continuing to try to advance along this line of contact in the west. But when we go over to the live update map, which is significantly better, you guys can see a little bit more about what is Russia's strategy here in Bakhmut. So you guys can see, first off, that they have really become more dense and timed in their ground assaults. As we saw yesterday, there were very few. It was primarily shelling, and now across the line, there is significant ground assaults taking place. So I think you are starting to see a Russian battle rhythm be established. But what's significant is where these attacks are happening, okay? So you guys can see that the first is in the south here at Optine, where Russian forces appear to be trying to effectively hold this village on the outskirts, Optine. And you can see that they hold this more open terrain to the south. It looks like, again, agrarian areas, a river here, but we've seen defensive strong points are usually at their best in this conflict when they are an urban area. Houses, basements, streets, these are really good defensive positions. And right now, the Russians don't control much of any. They control a small cluster of buildings to the south of Optine. What they want to do is control this main area here, where they can really start to occupy and use as a strong point to become hard to dislodge and cut off use of the T513 highway north to south. Now, again, they've already done that, right? Ukrainians aren't using this, but Russians can use it to resupply their forces. You can see it forms a pretty good line of with what they call a ground line of control, an interior support line from other areas in occupied Ukraine. So Russia definitely wants to establish this position here and help to affect the encirclement of Bakhmut, which I think is their larger objective. I would expect to see actually attacks happen in the near future near Klishchiivka as part of this encirclement effort, and in Andriivka, right? If they can take Optine, then it's going to be easier for them to engage in this flanking maneuver. You can see, literally, if you control Optine, it can physically provide cover. You can put your mortars here, your indirect fire here, and use it to help cover you as you try to control maybe this forest here, this open terrain, and affect more of an encirclement of Bakhmut. Again, the complete encirclement, probably not going to happen. And Russian commanders are probably aware of this because this H-32 highway, any forces that enter between Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar are going to probably get torn up from two sides. In the north, you guys can see they're trying the same thing. They're trying to seize a semi-developed kind of urban strong point in Pidhorodne. And while this looks a little less developed, as we've seen, woods, even in the winter, are still good defensive strong points to be able to seize, right? They provide overhead cover, and you can dig in a forest more easily. Like we've seen, even the trees themselves are raw materials that can really be effective in constructing defensive positions with overhead cover. And so I think they will want to seize this area of tree lines here. They may also want to seize this village in an effort to, again, form a strong point that cuts off this MO3 highway. This would be significant because, as you guys can see, the more of MO3 they cut off, the more this portion of the highway is not that significant, but this intersection looks very significant in terms of allowing Ukrainian forces to refit and resupply all of their forces that are operating out of Bakhmut itself. And so I think what we're seeing here is that Russia does want to effect a partial encirclement. I think you'll see them go no further again than this wood line here in the south, and probably the furthest I think they would ever aspire to go is Krasna Hora. And if they can lock those two in, then I think you'll see them try to pummel Bakhmut with artillery. You can imagine how much artillery they can bring to bear if they're able to get two big salients like that. Of course, there's some problems, right? They would have to really have their forces very extended, especially on the north, in order to affect this. And as long as Ukrainians can hold this Bakhmutsky village, then any efforts to sort of extend their forces are going to be met with a lot of resistance because they'll be subject to attacks on two sides. And it's just, you cannot be on the offense and still be attacked on two sides, not without a massive, massive advantage in numbers and or technology. So this is just a hard nut to crack for the Russians. And is this the best strategy? I actually don't know. If I had the Russian army to work with and I had to seize Bakhmut from the actual Ukrainian army, I don't know how I would try to solve it. I think this is probably close to what I would try to do. I would probably just try to isolate Bakhmut itself, limit my attacks in the city, and I would probably try to seize as many of these outlying villages as possible. I would probably focus on the north and try to get Bakhmutsky, Soledar, Krasna Hora, try to seize all of this area, right? That would help me, Pidhorodne, that would help me cut off all this northern part of Bakhmut. And then I could try to affect this southern salient a little bit. But like we talked about, there's only so much value you're going to get out of the southern salient. So that's what I think you may see Russia try to do. It sort of reflects what they're trying to do in these attacks. Again, would I do all of them at once? No. I would pick one strategically significant village. I would put the vast majority of my forces onto it, and I would try to seize one at a time. But Could I do that with recently mobilized troops and a really high attrition rate among my leaders? Maybe not. I might not be physically able to get an army to organize itself and do that. So I think Russia really is going to have their work seriously cut out for them, as long as Ukrainian forces, again, use these existing strong points to try to make this as punishing as possible for Russian forces. And at some point, as we've discussed, Russian troops, Russia is probably, while they make these statements about wanting to fight a lot longer, it's not clear on how they will do that. And when we look, for example, the BBC's Russia service and one of the few remaining independent Russian outlets, Media Zona, looked at the deaths that were confirmable in this conflict. They looked at 10,000 confirmed killed Russian soldiers. And what they found, which was fascinating, is that in the Moscow area, right, this is where this is one of the wealthiest and most well-connected demographic of Russians live, right? It's literally the capital city. Only 54 confirmed deaths were people who resided in Moscow. And this reflects the fact that, again, a lot of ethnic Russians and rural Russians are the ones who are fighting this conflict and paying the price. Russia knows that even though 10% of its population is in Moscow, they basically can't be touched because of the outrage that it would generate among, ethnic Russians. And so you end up with a situation where Ukraine knows Russia cannot backfill many of these troops. And the more it eliminates in these sort of reckless battles, the less are going to be available for combat in the spring. And I suspect that's their strategy, is to get Russia to burn its troops at the fastest possible rate, knowing it cannot backfill them, or it will backfill them with even less trained, even less equipped troops. And then possibly in the spring, but maybe even in the dead of winter, when Russians are at their lowest, will you see a Ukrainian counteroffensive. That's just my thesis, guys. Obviously, I'm providing my analysis for free. And that's all I had, of course. As always, guys, if you want access to the uncensored combat videos, the kind YouTube will not let me show you, you want to become a member of the Patreon. Thanks so much to my lieutenant tier patrons. You guys are the ones who make this whole thing possible, and I will see you all in the next one.